thinking in terms of prophetic text that we looked at. Especially in this regard, I'm on a class that's an online class, and this particular class is looking at the Jewish backgrounds to the New Testament, and specifically focusing on the Gospels. And there are criteria that are used by scholars to say whether or not they think a particular Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is directed to the Jewish people or not directed to the Jewish people. And one of the criteria for it not being Jewish is if there is criticism of Jewish groups. Okay? So if it's critical of Jewish groups, that would mean it's not Jewish. Well, you run into a problem if you take that approach, because all the way through the prophets, they are critical of Israel. That's what our text in Isaiah was about. In other words, if you're bringing these sacrifices, stop bringing them if you're just going through the motions. If there's no true repentance, and you're just bringing a sacrifice to make a show of things, the prophets repeatedly say, stop doing it. And it's not because the prophets have a problem with the sacrifices. The problem is with the people and the hearts of the people. So oftentimes my Christian brothers will read the self-critique that goes on in the Torah and in the prophets and say, well, see there, the prophets even there, they say that the sacrifices, those aren't any good. It's right there. Sacrifice is bad. No, the problem isn't the sacrifices. He says, stop bringing the sacrifices. I don't want any more of your sacrifices. It's not because he doesn't want any more, he doesn't like the sacrifices. He's the one who commanded the sacrifices. It's because he doesn't like the fact that people are playing a game with the sacrifices. They can come in and just say, you know what? I don't have any heart for God whatsoever. I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm going to bring a sacrifice just so people think that I'm heading in the right direction. So, as long as they think I'm heading in the right direction, it's all good. So then he says, if that's your heart attitude, then don't bring the sacrifice. Again, not because the sacrifice is a problem, but because you're the problem. The problem is always us, the people, not the Torah. Yeah.
I don't think that's too early to give a comment, but
What?
I was thinking in Malachi, which would encourage what you just said, you know, about you're bringing me these sick animals, you're bringing me like the worst of what you have.
Exactly.
So that there you have it.
Yeah.
You know, confirming what you're saying about what's your attitude.
Right. I mean, look, he says all the way through the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, you can't bring me a sacrifice that is blemished, broken, busted. You can't say, you know what? I think I'll bring that thing to this. It's going to die anyway, right? It's probably going to keel over on its own. So tell you what I'll do. I'll just bring it to God. I mean, he'll never know that it's got a broken leg. He'll never figure it out. So, and you know, it was going to die anyway. So they can kill it at the tabernacle, and everybody will think, hey, that's great. God says, no, I don't want your blemished sacrifice. I don't want it if it's broken.
I want your best.
I want the best you have. Give me the best you have, not your worst. And if you're going to bring me that kind of sacrifice, then just leave it at home. I don't want that. Again, not because I don't want the sacrifice, but not that kind of sacrifice. That's no sacrifice. You're not giving anything up. So as we're thinking about these different sacrifices, I want to talk about the role of sacrifice in the Hebrew Scriptures and beyond. And I tell you why this is important. Because all the way through the Hebrews, all the way through the Apostolic Scripture, Levitical language is used, and if we don't realize that Levitical language is used, we will miss out on what the text is actually saying. Let me give you an example. I have to go back and we have to talk about the different offerings. So we have 5 different sacrifices. And in a moment, we're going to talk about all of them. We're going to go through all of them. But one of them is called a katat. The Hebrew word is katat. And they will translate the katat as sin offering, but it can also be a purity offering. So it could be for sin or for impurity. So with that understanding, and the word katat can mean the sin, I could say he has committed a katat, a sin. Or he is bringing a katat, a sin offering. So now listen to this verse in the Apostolic Scriptures. He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Or, he who knew no sin became a sin offering for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. That reads much different.
Yeah, it does. That's interesting.
That's a completely different reading. But if you don't know Hebrew, you don't understand that it can be katat, sin, or katat, sin offering, depending on the context. So this affects how we read the Apostolic Scriptures and how we interpret them, because over and over again, Levitical language is used in the Apostolic Scriptures, and if we're not aware of that language, we will not understand what's being said.
So in the Christian churches, it's very common that we say that Jesus became sin for us, but what you're presenting is saying that not necessarily, but he did become the sin offering, which is a biblical standard.
Yeah, he was a sin offering for us. He did not become a sinner. He became a sin offering. That's worlds apart in how you view theology, how you view who he is. Did he become a sinner, or did he become a sin offering?
Which has to be perfect.
Yeah, so these are poles apart, folks. Yeah.
Which would, and the whole statement would be contradictory, because he who knew no sin became sin. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, it's on the theology of it becomes difficult. But people say, well, he became a sinner for us. He took our sin, and I get what they're saying. He took our sin upon himself. But that's what a sin offering does. You'll notice that it's called shmicha. Shmicha is where you lay your hands on the animal, you place your hands on the animal, and you confess your sins over that animal. You metaphorically transfer by your confession your sin to this animal. You lay your hands on this animal. Now, let's talk for a moment about uncleanness, or what the text will say is impurity. Impurity in and of itself is not a sin. You can become impure for many different reasons, most of which have nothing to do with having committed a sin. Let me give you an example. If a woman has a child, according to Leviticus chapter 12, she becomes impure or unclean. All that means is this: if a person is unclean, they cannot enter the tabernacle, or what later would become the temple. It just means you can't go in there. There is a remedy, and if you don't accept the remedy for uncleanness, then you have sinned. Once the remedy is given and you refuse to do what God has said in order to remedy your uncleanness, then, yes, you have sinned. But nobody has sinned. A woman has not sinned by becoming pregnant and giving birth to a child. She has become unclean. And all unclean means is this: you can't go into the tabernacle.
You're ritually impure.
You're ritually impure. Yeah. Now, here's the reason. God is fully alive. Therefore, nobody who is in any diminished capacity of life, if blood levels have gone down, let's say you're bleeding out, blood levels have gone down, you must wait a requisite amount of time, blood levels come back, you can go in. Semen is a life fluid. If a man has a seminal emission, having relations with his wife, he gives off a life fluid. He must wait until that life fluid has come back to its normal levels, then do an immersion, and he can come back in. No problem. It just means you can't go in the tabernacle. Most people existed in a state of uncleanness until the time that they needed to go to the tabernacle. Then you would do an immersion, and you would wait the amount of time needed, and you could go in. The number one, and we'll get to this a little bit later on in our study of Leviticus, the number one most defiling thing is corpse defilement. If you touch a corpse, if your shadow comes over a corpse, you are now corpse defiled. That's a 7-day period of uncleanness.
Even your shadow?
That's going to require an immersion, actually 2 immersions, and it's going to require the sprinkling from the water and ashes of the red heifer. Okay? You're going to have that in order to go back in. Because death is completely antithetical to who God is. In fact, what happens with Yeshua? Every time Yeshua comes in contact with a person who's dead, they come alive again. I remember as a pastor, when early on, I was thinking, I want to see what Jesus would do in a memorial service. I mean, what would Jesus do? What would he say in a memorial service? When he says stuff like this, get up and walk. Come out of the, Lazarus, come forth. Like, well, okay, that's not going to work.
Well, that works pretty good, I think.
Works for them. I'm just saying, not going to work for me. So he's so fully alive that when people who are sick, who are dying, they're in the process of decay, he reverses the process. If they're already dead, they just come back to life. Because he's so fully alive. So what he says is this: if you have any diminished life about you, if you're broken, let's say you have a broken limb, you can't go in the tabernacle. Let's say you were born without a limb, you can't go in. People say, well, that's unfair. God says, no. Everything that comes in here has to be whole. It has to be the way it will be in the world to come. Because the inside of the tabernacle is a picture of the way things are supposed to be in the world to come. Everything whole and what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
So what about something like, I just had a tooth removed?
Ooh, I don't know.
And a lot of people have had a tooth removed.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. It doesn't address that one specifically.
They couldn't do it back then.
What if you had a tooth removed?
Tooth.
Specifically, tooth extraction. It talks about limbs, exterior things you can see.
Well, I mean, even if you didn't have it removed, what if it fell out? Your teeth had a problem and brought it out or something.
I think you have to allow for it because you have, children lose their teeth. And then you obviously get them back, but I'm saying...
Right, but adults don't.
Right.
When an adult loses a tooth, it's a problem.
So this would be the kind of question that they would ask in a halakhic discussion. This would be one of those rabbinic debates as to, can you go in with, they'd have a big debate over it.
Isn't that what we're doing?
Huh?
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know the answer.
No, we're not.
No, I'm not. I know this. The Torah talks about extremities and things we can see. It doesn't address things that really can't be seen. Yeah.
And they have to do with if it's bleeding or not, too. If you're bleeding, you probably wouldn't be able to.
Well, actually no, because, yes and no, because obviously if there's ongoing bleeding, then you cannot go into the tabernacle. However, if you were born without, let's say you're born without one arm, you still can't go in.
But if the tooth is gone and you're bleeding, you probably...
Obviously, but once the bleeding has stopped,
Yeah.
could you go in? That's one of those halakhic questions that rabbis would debate, and they'd have all kinds of discussion over. Gallbladder, yeah. Today we're removing body parts.
Yeah.
We're removing, kidneys, we're removing gallbladders, we're doing all kinds of extraction on the body. Would that have allowed you to go or not go in? I don't know. Those are interesting questions. They weren't doing those, obviously. Yes.
When God set up this tabernacle, it was when they came out of Egypt. They were in the wilderness, and He was feeding them the food, the manna.
Correct.
He was feeding them. He was giving them. Our world today, our food is tainted.
Yeah.
We could be completely unwhole to do anything that He set up in that picture. All of us.
Yeah. And all of us right now live in a state of uncleanness. We don't have a tabernacle. We don't have... Now, as you look at the synagogues, and as you look at the southern steps of the temple today, in the excavations of these synagogues and the excavation of the southern steps of the temple, there are what are called mikvaot, ritual immersion pools. One is supposed to immerse themselves in what is called mayim kaim, which means living water. The water has to be moving. Generally, they like a waterfall, a river, some type of water that moves in and out to metaphorically move the impurity away. Okay? Rivers are great. Jordan River, great. Ein Gedi, where you have waterfalls coming down out of the mountains and it's cascading down the mountain. Those kind of things are great. Even the Sea of Galilee, even though it's technically a lake, it's nice because it does have waves that come in and waves that go out. So you can use even a lake that's really quite big. In their thinking, you would do immersions dozens of times in a given lifetime. As many times as you went up to the tabernacle, you would do an immersion. We think of baptism as one and done. You do a baptism, you're done, you're through. They would do immersions ad infinitum. In fact, we know from Qumran that they were doing immersions every day. They were like, we need to live in this state of purity all the time, so we're going to do an immersion every day. Okay? So, we don't think that way. We think, baptism, one, you're done, move on. But when it came to going into the temple or into the synagogues, they thought in terms of immersion, okay, to be pure. Okay? Any questions on that? On mikvah, okay? Well, there's tons of them. We found archaeologically with almost every synagogue there's a mikvah, and at the southern steps there are mikvah for immersion. Yes.
For the woman with the hemorrhage of 12 years, so for 12 years, that's also would be a part of her concern because she was ritually unclean that time until she touched the wings of Yeshua and found healing.
Everybody that I can think of that Yeshua healed was ritually impure. So, yeah, you would have to wait the amount of time, do the immersion. Yeah, with her, 12 years of, I suspect,
not being able to go to the temple.
Here's my suspicion on this. And this is only my thoughts on why this woman is bleeding out for 12 years. I suspicion that she was at one time pregnant, and all of the placenta was not removed from the uterus. And if all of the placenta is not, even if a little bit is not removed from the uterus, you'll continue to bleed because the body thinks that it needs to put blood to that area because there's a life there. So that's just a suspicion that there was probably that's one reason why she's continually bleeding out for 12 years. I mean, she's hemorrhaging. The blood loss would have been enormous. And she can't go into the temple with that kind of condition. And everybody that he healed has a condition that prohibits them from going into the temple. Now let's talk about the different sacrifices. The first 3 sacrifices are voluntary. Hear me on this. The first 3 sacrifices are voluntary. There's no compulsion to offer these sacrifices. You can if you want, but you don't have to. The first one is called an olah. An olah, which is from Allah, which means to go up. Because all of it is placed on the altar and burned completely. In fact, this was what Abraham was asked to do with Isaac in Genesis 22. Place him on the altar as a whole burnt offering. They'll call it a whole burnt offering. You walk into the tabernacle, you have the laver, and then you have the bronze altar. And the sacrifice would be placed on that bronze altar, and all of it would go up in smoke. None of it would be eaten by anybody. It was all just burned. Now, the bones would be left, and those bones would then be taken out and buried somewhere else, outside of the tabernacle. Okay? So the bones are they're going to char, but they're not going to be completely consumed. So you have a whole burnt offering. That's the first one. First offering. Whole burnt offering. Then the second offering. Second offering is, we can actually skip to the third one. Most of you are familiar. Today we're going to talk about in your notes was the Shalomim, the peace offering. That's voluntary. I'll go back to the second one. We have Olah, whole burnt offering. I mentioned the Shalomim, which is a peace offering. Both those are voluntary. I mentioned earlier the Katat offering, which is now that one is not voluntary. Katat means purity or the issue of sin. Because the word katat is an archery term, just like the word Torah is. Torah means aiming at the mark. You're going the direction of the aim. That's Torah. If they say to me, which direction should I go? I say, well, you need to go this direction. That's Torah. That's me giving you instruction aiming you in a particular direction. The word katat means you missed the mark. You missed the mark. You aimed at something, but it veered off. So katat offering refers to unintentional sin. Let's talk about unintentional. What do we mean by unintentional? Let me give you an example of unintentional. Unintentional would be, you go to, I've had this happen several times, unfortunately. You go to a restaurant and you think to yourself, I want to eat kosher. I want to eat like Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14 asked me to eat. And so I think to myself, well, I'll get some green beans. That should be safe. I mean, green beans. They're beans. There's not even any meat in there. It comes off of it's a plant. That should be safe, right? And you think to yourself, well, that's pretty safe. It's a vegetable. And then it comes, and you don't realize, but they've chopped up real fine bacon, and they've cooked it in lard. And now you've eaten something that's unclean. That's an unclean animal. Unintentional. But you did it anyway.
Most of the refried beans in Mexico.
Mexican restaurants, refried beans are another one. You're like, oh my stars. I don't even know how I got this stuff. But it's unintentional. You're like, how'd this happen? I didn't mean to, but you know what? Here's the point. Even if you didn't mean to, you still violated. And it still has to be dealt with. It's still a violation. People say, well, if I didn't mean to, then it's not a violation. Torah says, no. Even if you didn't mean to violate and you violated, it's still a violation. It's still a sin. That's a katat offering. It's unintentional. Unintentional. Now, the katat offering splits off because it's also for impurity. This is why the woman who has a child in Leviticus 12, she has become impure. So because of her impurity, she has to offer a katat offering, a purity offering. Okay? Fifth offering is what's called an asham. Now, an asham offering is mandatory if the sin you've committed is negligence. If you've committed a sin because of negligence, you didn't really intend to sin, but because of your negligence, a sin occurred. That's different from unintentional. Yes?
Isn't theft in that category? It's a steal you're supposed to restore?
Yeah, you still have to restore.
But that's not a negligence.
Well, I can show you how. Well, watch. Give me an example of negligence.
I mean, I can see negligence, but I wouldn't. Can you really classify it as entirely as a negligence?
No, actually, stealing. Well, hold on. Stealing is intentional.
Well, right. That's what I'm saying.
Right. We're not even talking about that yet.
But it's not a matter of negligence. But it talks about that offering particularly being, if you steal, then you're supposed to repay, 5 oxen or 4 sheep.
Yeah.
And then take that offering.
Right. There is 2 parts to this. So hold on. I'm getting to both of them. Hold on. So it's both. It's not just. It's negligence and some intentional. Some of the intentional side. Not all of them. Most of it's negligent. Most of them are for negligence. Let me give you an example of negligence. You have a second story to your house, and on that second story there's a little balcony that leads to the ground, and you don't put up a barrier around your balcony to where somebody who comes along the edge might fall off. And if somebody falls off the edge of your house, even though you didn't push them, you never intended them to fall, and it's not even necessarily your fault that they were over in that area. However, your negligence got this person injured. Then you're responsible. That requires you to offer an asham, a guilt offering. And as Cohen said, there are a few category of intentional sins that also the asham has to be offered. Now let me double back. Let me go through these. Here's the offerings. We have the olah, the whole burnt offering. The one I skipped is called the mincha. It's a grain offering. It's very difficult because in most of your translations, or at least in the King James translation, this was extremely difficult because they called it a meat offering. And there's no meat in it. It's all grain. You bring some grain, you bring some oil. It's actually fried on the altar. Half of it is given to God, and the other half is eaten by the priest and the person bringing it. It's called a grain offering, actually, or a cereal offering. That's called mincha. So you have olah, whole burnt offering. Mincha, grain offering, voluntary. Olah, voluntary. Mincha, grain offering, voluntary. Shalomim, peace offering. God has blessed you. You want to do something to say, God, thank you for all that you've done for me, a peace offering, also called a thanksgiving offering. Then we have the katat offering. For unintentional sins, the katat is for where you've had impurity or where you've had an unintentional sin. Then we have the last one is the asham, which is if you've had negligence, and for a few categories of intentional. So the question becomes this. Here's a $1 million question. What sacrifice is there for intentional sin?
Depends on the sin.
Well, what sacrifice is there for intent? In other words, let me give you an example. Here's an intentional sin. There's certain sins that just by their nature have to be intentional. You can't accidentally do certain things. One of them is stealing, for instance. You could accidentally steal something.
Mhm.
You could. You could accidentally steal something. So stealing is one of those categories that it could be intentional or it could be unintentional. Depending on, you didn't even know it was in your stuff. How many of you have ever packed up your stuff when you were around something and you packed up something that didn't belong to you? And then as you're unpacking your things, you realize, oh, that doesn't belong to me. Joseph, yeah. He puts it in the bag, okay? Yeah, you got it. Yeah. So it's one of those things that you have that can be intentional or unintentional. Okay? So, but what about intentional sin? What if it was planned? I'll give you an example of one. Here's an intentional sin. Not a person in this room hasn't had this happen to you. We've all done this one, I think. So I think we're safe in saying everybody here will resonate with this one. There's not a person in the room who hasn't gotten upset and mad at somebody and said something you shouldn't have. In anger, unkind, unloving. And as soon as you did it, or thereafter, not too long after, you thought to yourself, man, that was the stupidest thing in the world I did. I should never have said that. I am so sorry I said that. And maybe you even apologized to the person you said it to. And you thought to yourself, man, I should never have gotten that upset. I should never have gotten mad and said those kind of things to them. I'm so remorseful. I'm so sorry that I did what I did. Should never have happened. But in the moment, it was definitely intentional. It wasn't accidental. Nobody made you do it. Nobody pushed you. You chose to become upset.